They told him if he worked hard and played by the rules, nothing could take away what he built. Louis Shane spent 50 years proving them right. Then one morning, in less time than it takes to drink a cup of coffee, he lost everything. And the worst part? It was completely legal. Before you click away thinking this is another sad story that'll never happen to you, stop. Because what happened to Louis isn't rare. It's not some freak accident. It's happening right now to someone just like you. Someone who did everything right. And by the end of the story, you're going to question everything you thought you knew about owning property in America. Picture this, you're 23 years old. You don't have money for a down payment, so you do something crazy. You walk into the woods with a chainsaw and you build your castle with your own 2 hands. Every nail, every board, every drop of sweat. 50 years later, that house isn't just walls and a roof. It's where you buried your wife's ashes in the garden. It's where your children learned to walk. It's where pencil marks on a doorframe track 3 generations growing up. Now imagine a stranger in a $3,000 suit walking up your driveway, handing you a folder, and telling you that you have 24 hours to become homeless. In your own home, the home you built. Here's what makes this story devastating. Louis Shane didn't lose his home because he stopped paying taxes. He didn't lose it to foreclosure or medical debt or some scam artist. He lost it because he tried to do the right thing. 10 years ago, he signed a piece of paper that was supposed to protect his family. That paper, that one signature, gave someone else the power to take everything. And when he tried to fight back, the judge looked at him and basically said, "I don't care that you built this house. I don't care that your wife is buried there. I don't care about your memories. The only thing that matters is what's written on this deed." And just like that, 50 years of work vanished. Think about this for a second. Right now, you probably believe you own your house, your car, your stuff. But do you really? Or are you just renting it from a system that can take it all away the moment you sign the wrong paper, trust the wrong person, or make one mistake? Because here's what nobody tells you. Ownership in America isn't about who built something. It's not about who sacrificed for it. It's about who has their name on the paperwork. And Louis Shane learned that lesson in the most brutal way possible. What I'm about to show you isn't just Louis's story. It's a warning. It's a wake-up call about how fragile everything you've built really is. You're going to watch a 73-year-old man walk through his home for the last time, touching the walls he raised, saying goodbye to the ghosts that live there. You're going to see what the legal system does to people who played by every rule and still lost everything. And by the end, you're going to have to answer one impossible question. If you were Louis Shane, standing in front of that judge, what would you have done? Would you sign away your dignity and pay rent to live in the house you built? Or would you walk away and start over at 73 years old with nothing but your pride? Before we start, I need you to do something. Ask yourself right now, could this happen to me? Don't just think about it, really ask. Because thousands of Americans just like Louis are losing everything they've worked for, and most of them never saw it coming. They thought they were safe. They thought the law would protect them. This isn't an easy story to watch, but it's one you need to hear. Because the American dream that Louis believed in, the one that says hard work equals security, it's more complicated than they told us. And somewhere out there, someone else is about to learn that lesson the way Louis did. So stay with me, because what happens next will change how you think about everything you own. Louis Shane's hands tell a story that no lawyer could ever understand. At 73, they're still thick with calluses that map out 50 years of labor. Rough patches on his palms where hammers lived, ridges along his fingers that remember the bite of sawdust and splinters. These aren't the soft hands of a man who bought his way into comfort. These are the hands that built a kingdom from nothing but will and wood. 1974. That's when it started. Most young men his age were walking into banks with their hats in their hands, begging strangers in ties to approve loans for cookie-cutter houses in developments with names like Meadowbrook and Sunset Estates. Not Louis. He walked into the New Hampshire woods with a chainsaw, a pickup truck full of determination, and a dream that didn't require anyone's permission. No mortgage, no debt, no banker deciding if he was worthy. He cleared that land himself. Every tree that came down, he felled it. Every stump that needed pulling, he pulled it. His brothers came up on weekends, Joe with his bad back and Tom with his worst jokes, and together they mixed concrete by hand until their shoulders screamed. They didn't have fancy equipment. They had shovels and stubbornness. They poured that foundation in sections, working through summer heat that made the air shimmer and fall cold that turned their breath to fog. When the beams went up, Louis was the one raising them. Pine sap stuck to his shirt like a badge of honor, the smell of fresh-cut lumber filling his lungs so deep he swears he can still taste it decades later. He remembers the weight of every board, the resistance of every nail, the satisfaction when a wall finally stood square and true. This wasn't just construction. This was creation. Every swing of the hammer was a promise. This will stand. This will last. This will be mine. He didn't hire contractors or consultants. Didn't need blueprints drawn up by architects who'd never touched a 2x4. He knew what a home needed because he knew what a life needed. Strong bones, solid foundation, walls that could weather any storm. Room for a family to grow. Space for children to run. A porch where you could sit in the evening and watch the sun die behind the trees you'd left standing because they were too beautiful to cut down. This wasn't real estate to Louis Shane. It was never about property value or market conditions or investment portfolios. This was his fortress, his kingdom. Every square inch of that house was soaked in sweat, drenched in sacrifice, built with the kind of stubborn determination that used to define this country. The kind that says a man doesn't need permission to build a life, he just needs his hands, his back, and the refusal to quit when the work gets hard. And for 50 years, those walls stood as proof that he was right. The white sedan appeared on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, at precisely 8:14 a.m. Louis would remember that detail later, the exact time, because some moments brand themselves into your memory whether you want them there or not. The car rolled up his gravel driveway slowly, almost respectfully. Expensive tires crunching over stones Louis had hauled and placed himself 40 years ago. Each crunch sounded like a small bone breaking. The man who stepped out wore a suit so crisp it looked like it had never seen a wrinkle, like maybe he'd put it on fresh in the driveway just to make an entrance. Italian loafers caught the morning light, shoes that probably cost more than Louis's first truck, more than the chainsaw that started everything. The man walked carefully, deliberately, picking his steps like he was afraid the earth itself might dirty him, like the ground Louis had cleared and tamed might somehow reach up and stain those perfect shoes. Under his arm, the man carried a manila folder. Thin, unremarkable, the kind of thing you'd walk past in an office without a second glance. But Louis knew what was inside. Words. Legal words. The kind that don't care about calluses or concrete or 50 years of waking up in the same bedroom. The kind that can end a lifetime with a few paragraphs and a signature line. Louis sat on his porch swing. The same swing that had held his wife on summer evenings when the fireflies came out and she'd lean her head on his shoulder without saying anything because nothing needed to be said. The same swing where his children sprawled on lazy Sundays, fighting over who got to push off with their feet. The same swing where his grandchildren visited, less and less frequently as the years passed and their lives got busier and Louis got older and somehow the distance between them grew even though nobody moved. The chains of the swing creaked. They'd been creaking for 20 years. He kept meaning to oil them, but some sounds become part of the soundtrack of a place. Some sounds you stop hearing until the moment you realize you'll never hear them again. He'd known this was coming. For weeks he'd known. The phone calls from lawyers. The registered letters. The certified mail that required his signature just to tell him he was losing the right to sign anything that mattered. Knowing doesn't make it easier. Knowing just gives you time to imagine it over and over, to rehearse the moment in your head until the real thing feels like a memory you're living through for the 100th time. The man in the suit reached the porch steps. He looked up at Louis with practiced sympathy, the kind they probably teach in law school, somewhere between contract law and professional courtesy. And Louis understood that everything he'd built with his hands was about to be taken away with words on paper he'd probably never fully understand. 10 years ago, Louis Shane thought he was being smart. His lawyer, a family friend named Bill Thompson who he'd known since high school, who'd been at his wedding, who'd taught David how to fish, sat across from him at the kitchen table and suggested putting David on the deed. Estate planning, Bill called it. Sliding the papers across the same table, where Lewis had taught his son to do homework. Keeps it in the family. Avoids probate. Protects your legacy. It sounded responsible. It sounded like the kind of thing careful fathers did to take care of their children even after they were gone. It sounded safe, coming from a man Lewis had trusted for 40 years. So he signed. Didn't think twice about it. Didn't hire a second lawyer to review it. Didn't ask the hard questions. Because you trust your own blood, don't you? You trust that the boy you raised, the man who learned to swing a hammer at your side when he was 12 years old, the son who helped pour concrete and raise beams, you trust he would never let anything happen to the home you built together. But life has a cruel sense of humor. Life has a way of making fools of even the most careful men, of turning good decisions into disasters you never saw coming. When David's marriage fell apart 3 years later, it was messy the way these things always are. Lawyers got involved. Assets got listed. And suddenly, without warning, Lewis's house, the fortress he'd built nail by nail, the kingdom he'd carved from wilderness, became a line item in a divorce decree. An asset. A number on a spreadsheet in a court filing. Property to be divided between two people who'd stopped loving each other, and one of them had never even lived there, had never walked those halls, had never known the sound of those creaking floorboards or the way morning light came through the kitchen window. David called him crying. "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't know they could do this. I tried to protect it." The lawyers say. Lewis didn't want to hear what the lawyers said. He'd heard enough from lawyers. They spoke a language where homes became real property and 50 years of memories became marital assets, and a father's legacy became something to split down the middle like a savings account or a used car. The woman who'd never planted a flower in that garden, who'd never sat on that porch swing, who'd never mixed concrete or raised a beam or bled into that soil. She now owned half of everything Lewis had built. And her lawyer, the one in the expensive suit with the manila folder, he'd made sure she knew exactly what that half was worth in dollars and cents. Not in sweat, not in sacrifice, not in the 50 years Lewis had poured into those walls. Just cold numbers that didn't account for the incalculable. The man in the suit delivered his message with the practiced sympathy of someone who'd done this before. Many times before. You could hear it in his voice, that soft, clinical tone lawyers use when they're trying to sound human, when they're trying to pretend that the words coming out of their mouths aren't about to shatter someone's entire world. The court order was clear, he explained. Unambiguous. Final. The property was to be vacated. Vacated. Like Lewis was a squatter. Like he'd been trespassing for 50 years on land he'd cleared with his own hands. The new owners, David's ex-wife and her attorney, would take possession at noon the following day. 24 hours. That's how long Lewis had to pack up a lifetime. A crew was already scheduled to assist with the transition. That's what they call it when they throw your life into a dumpster. A transition. Like he was moving offices or changing apartments. Like 50 years could be boxed up and relocated with professional efficiency and a couple of guys in moving uniforms who wouldn't know the difference between a hand-carved table and something from a furniture store. Lewis looked at the man for a long moment. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "What gives you the right?" For the first time, the man in the suit looked uncomfortable. Actually uncomfortable, not lawyer uncomfortable. He shifted his weight from one expensive shoe to the other, like the ground had suddenly become unsteady. His practiced sympathy cracked just enough for Lewis to see the human underneath, and maybe a flicker of shame. He explained, using words like jurisdiction and legal precedent and court authority, that according to the law, Lewis didn't own those walls anymore. Technically, legally, on paper, always on paper, he was a guest who'd overstayed his welcome. A tenant without a lease. Someone permitted to stay out of kindness, and that permission had been revoked. In his own home, the home he'd built with his own hands, the home where his wife had died, the home where his children had grown up, the home that knew his footsteps better than anyone else's, that held his breath in its walls, that had been shaped by his will and his work. The law didn't care about any of that. The law cared about signatures, about whose name was typed on which line of which document filed in which office. The law had decided that the woman who'd never turned a key in that lock, who'd never watched snow fall on that roof, who'd never known what it felt like to stand in those rooms and feel time itself accumulating, She had more right to it than the man who dreamed it into existence. Lewis understood then what he'd always suspected but never wanted to believe. The law isn't about justice. It's about rules. And sometimes the rules make weapons out of good intentions, and sometimes those weapons get pointed at people who spent their whole lives playing by every rule they were given. But Lewis Shane wasn't a man who went quietly. He fought. God, did he fight. For months, he threw himself against the machine that was grinding him down, believing that somewhere, somehow, someone would see reason. Someone would look at what he'd built and say, "This isn't right." He hired a lawyer. Then another when the first one told him there was nothing to be done, that the deed was ironclad, that the law was clear. The second lawyer said the same thing, just more expensive. The third lawyer, a young guy fresh out of law school who still believed justice mattered, took the case even though he knew it was hopeless. They filed motions. They argued precedents. They stood in a courtroom and tried to make a judge understand that ownership should mean something more than ink on paper. The judge looked bored. Actually bored. Lewis watched him check his watch twice during the hearing, saw him stifle a yawn while Lewis's lawyer explained that this man had poured the foundation of this house with his own hands. The judge ruled based on signatures and statutes, not on sweat and sacrifice. He spoke about clear chain of title and proper conveyance and marital property division, like he was discussing the weather. The judge didn't care that Lewis had poured the foundation. Didn't care that his wife's ashes were scattered in the garden beneath the oak tree they'd planted on their 10th anniversary. Didn't care that the growth chart on the kitchen door frame tracked 3 generations of children growing up. David at 5, Sarah at 3, then David's kids, then Sarah's. Pencil marks and dates that told the story of a family in inches and years. None of that mattered. None of it was admissible. None of it changed the fundamental legal reality that the deed said what it said, and signatures don't care about context. What mattered was the paperwork. The legal fiction that says ownership is about ink on paper, not about the years you've invested, the memories you've made, the blood you've given to a piece of ground that knows your footsteps better than your own children do. David came to him after the ruling, sat at that same kitchen table where Lewis had signed away his future 10 years ago. "Dad," he said, his voice breaking. "Dad, please, take the money. They're offering enough for an apartment in town. You could be comfortable. You could." But Lewis cut him off. He wasn't angry at David. Couldn't be. This wasn't his son's fault. But he couldn't do it. Couldn't sign the settlement that would let him stay as a tenant, paying rent to strangers for the privilege of breathing air he'd breathed for 50 years. The money didn't matter. The apartment didn't matter. Pride is a heavy anchor, and it was dragging Lewis to the bottom. He knew it. David knew it. But some men would rather drown than let go of the only thing holding them down. With 24 hours left, Lewis walked through his house like a ghost haunting his own life. Every room held a lifetime. Every corner whispered memories that only he could hear. He moved slowly, deliberately, like if he paid enough attention he could memorize it all, could carry it with him somehow when they forced him to leave. In the hallway, he ran his fingers along the wallpaper. Faded roses on a cream background, the same pattern his wife had picked out in 1982, the year their daughter Sarah got married. She'd ordered it from a catalog, spent weeks deciding between this one and another with blue flowers. He remembered watching her hold up samples against the wall, asking his opinion like it mattered, like he could tell the difference. He'd said he liked the roses. She'd smiled and kissed his cheek and said she knew he would. He stopped at the spot where the floorboards still squeaked. Right there, 3 boards from the bathroom door. He tried to fix them a dozen times over the years, pulling up boards, adding shims, driving new nails. Nothing worked. The house just wanted to make that sound. He remembered the last time he tried, 30 years ago, lying on his back with tools spread around him while his wife stood behind him handing him nails, laughing about how he could build a whole house from scratch but couldn't silence one stubborn squeak. He'd laughed too, given up, decided some things were meant to stay broken. Now strangers would walk over that spot and never know why it sang. In the kitchen, he stopped at the door frame. His hand went to it automatically, muscle memory from 1,000 times standing there, measuring. The pencil marks were faded but still visible if you knew where to look. David, age 7, 1981. Sarah, age 10, 1984. Then later, in different handwriting because his hands had started shaking, Emma, age 5, 2003. Lucas, age 4, 2008. For generations marked in graphite on painted wood, these little monuments to time passing, proof that children grow and years disappear and houses remember even when people forget. He traced them with his finger, feeling the slight indent the pencil had left. David had stood here squirming, impatient to go play. Sarah had stood on tiptoes trying to make herself taller. The grandchildren had giggled, pressing their backs against the frame while Louis carefully marked above their heads, writing the date in his increasingly unsteady hand. The new owners would probably paint over them. Fresh coat, clean slate, erase the history like it never happened. They wouldn't know these marks meant anything. They'd just see old pencil scribblings that didn't match their aesthetic, that didn't fit their vision for their new investment property. The furniture would stay. All of it. Louis had decided that days ago, though the decision felt more like surrender than choice. The hand-carved dining table where 3 generations had shared meals, Thanksgiving dinners and birthday cakes and quiet Tuesday nights when it was just him and his wife eating soup in comfortable silence. He'd made that table from black walnut, spent 6 months on it, every joint perfect, every edge smooth. It weighed 300 pounds, too heavy to move, too sacred to abandon. The rocking chair in the corner of what used to be the nursery. He'd built it when Sarah was born, stayed up 3 nights straight sanding it until the wood felt like silk, because he didn't want any chance of a splinter touching his daughter's skin. He'd held both his children in that chair, rocking them through colic and nightmares and those first teeth breaking through. Later, he'd held his grandchildren the same way, the chair creaking the same rhythm it had for 40 years, a lullaby made of wood and time. The bed frame in the master bedroom, solid oak. He'd made it as a wedding present to himself and his wife because they couldn't afford to buy one, and he refused to start their marriage on a mattress on the floor. That bed had held their love and their fights and their grief and their joy. It had held them both on the night she died, when he'd climbed in beside her one last time even though she was already gone, because he couldn't imagine sleeping anywhere else. That bed would outlive them all, would still be solid when everyone who'd ever slept in it was dust. Everything too heavy to carry, too meaningful to abandon, too painful to watch being loaded into a truck by men who'd treat it like inventory, who wouldn't know the difference between his life's work and yard sale furniture. He packed 1 suitcase. That's what 50 years came down to. 1 suitcase. Clothes enough for a week, maybe 2. A few photographs in frames he'd made himself, simple pine, nothing fancy. His wife smiling on their wedding day. The kids when they were small. His wife's wedding ring. The band worn thin from decades of wear. And the deed to the family plot where she was buried. The only piece of property no one could take from him. The only ground he'd ever truly own. Everything else would become someone else's story. The woman who'd never walked these halls would sell it all, probably. List it online. Estate sale. Vintage furniture, solid wood. Must go. Or maybe she'd donate it, take the tax write-off, feel good about giving to charity. Or maybe she'd just throw it away, haul it to the dump because it didn't match her style, didn't fit her Pinterest board vision for the house. The thought of strangers sleeping in his bed made Louis's stomach turn. Strangers eating at his table. Strangers walking over the floors he'd laid, board by board, their footsteps erasing his. It was like being erased while still breathing. Like watching yourself become a ghost before you're even dead. The last thing Louis did was lock the door. The same door he'd hung himself in 1974, spending an entire afternoon getting it perfectly level because a door that doesn't hang right will never close properly, will always let in drafts, will always feel wrong. He'd sanded it smooth, stained it dark walnut, fitted it into the frame with the precision of a man who understood that details matter, that the difference between good work and great work is measured in fractions of inches. The key turned in the lock with a click that sounded final. Permanent, like the closing of a book or the sealing of a tomb. He stood there on the porch, his hand still on the doorknob, feeling the cold brass under his palm. He'd touched that doorknob 10,000 times. Coming home from work, letting the kids in after school, stepping out for morning coffee, Every day for 50 years, that doorknob had been the threshold between the world and his sanctuary. And in that moment, with his hand on metal he'd installed himself, Lewis understood something that 50 years of hard work had tried to hide from him. A truth so fundamental it should have been obvious, but we spend our whole lives pretending it isn't real. You don't really own anything in this world. Not really. You're just looking after it until the system or fate or someone with better lawyers decides it's someone else's turn. You're a temporary custodian of things that will outlast you, borrowing time and space and calling it ownership because the lie is more comfortable than the truth. The American dream they sold him as a young man: work hard, build something, leave it for your children. It was always conditional. Always came with invisible fine print he'd never thought to read. Always temporary, though they never mentioned that part. Always one signature away from disappearing. One mistake. One tragedy. One well-meaning decision that turns into a weapon aimed at your heart. He'd built his fortress thinking it would protect him. Spent 50 years raising walls and laying foundations and creating something so solid that nothing could shake it. But fortresses can become prisons. The walls you build to keep the world out can trap you inside. And the life he'd constructed, brick by brick and nail by nail, had become something the law said didn't belong to him anymore. The walls he'd raised to keep chaos at bay had trapped him inside a story where he was no longer the author. Where signatures mattered more than sacrifice. Where ink on paper carried more weight than blood and sweat and 50 years of waking up in the same bedroom, walking the same floors, breathing the same air. He'd thought building something meant it was yours. He'd thought creation implied ownership. He'd thought wrong. Lewis started his truck, the same Ford F-150 he'd bought used 20 years ago, paid for in cash like everything else because debt always felt like a chain around his neck. The engine turned over with a familiar rattle, the same sound it had made for 2 decades, reliable in the way old things are when you take care of them. He put it in reverse and rolled down that gravel driveway one last time, tires crunching over stones he'd hauled and placed, following the path he'd driven thousands of times before. In the rearview mirror, he watched the house growing smaller. The lights were still on in the windows, glowing warm against the afternoon gray. He'd forgotten to turn them off. Or maybe he'd left them on purpose. Some small act of defiance, some final fuck you to the system that was taking everything. Let the electric meter run on someone else's dime now. Let them pay for the light. The house shrank behind him. The porch where he'd proposed to his wife. The bedroom window where he'd watched for his children coming home. The chimney that carried smoke from fires he'd built on winter nights. All of it getting smaller, more distant, already starting to feel like something that happened to someone else. The pine trees swallowed it. One moment it was there in his mirror, the next it was just green branches and empty road. And Lewis realized he wasn't crying. He'd thought he would be. Thought this moment would break him open. But he was too empty for tears. Too hollowed out. Grief had taken everything it could take over the past weeks. And what was left wasn't sadness anymore. It was just absence. Somewhere behind him, his wife was in the garden beneath the oak tree. His memories were soaked into those walls like water into wood. His whole life was in that piece of land. Every moment that mattered, every person he'd loved, every dream he'd built and lost and kept building anyway. All of it receding in his rearview mirror while he drove forward into nothing. But he was driving toward a future that felt like falling. Like stepping off a cliff and waiting to hit bottom. At 73, you don't start over. That's a young man's game, that fresh start mythology. At 73, you just survive the ending. You find a place to exist until you stop existing. You become smaller and quieter until you disappear completely. That night, in a motel room off Route 4 that smelled like disinfectant and defeat, Lewis Shane sat on a bed that wasn't his and stared at walls that held no memories. The television flickered blue light across unfamiliar furniture. Through thin walls, he could hear other people's lives. A couple arguing, a child crying, someone's television playing too loud. He'd become one more invisible casualty of a system that values signatures over sacrifice, that weighs paper heavier than people, that measures worth in ink and notary stamps instead of sweat and years and the kind of devotion that builds cathedrals from wilderness. The system had worked exactly as designed. And Lewis Shane, who'd spent 50 years building his American dream with his own 2 hands, Learn that dreams are only yours until someone with better lawyers decides they're not. This is Louis Shane's story, but it's happening to thousands of men and women just like him every single year. People who built their lives with their own hands, only to watch the law take it away with a stroke of a pen. So here's my question for you. If you were in Louis's position, would you have signed those papers and stayed as a tenant in your own home? Or would you have walked away with your pride intact, even if it meant losing everything? Tell me in the comments, because this conversation matters. And Louis's story deserves to be heard. If this story made you feel something, anger, sadness, or just the weight of how fragile security really is, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now, because every day, I bring you stories like Louis's. Real people, real struggles, the kind of stories that don't make the evening news but shape the lives of everyday Americans who played by the rules and still lost everything. And turn on that notification bell, because these stories matter too much to miss. When I post the next one, and trust me, it'll hit just as hard, you'll be the first to know. This channel exists because you're here, because you care about the truth behind the headlines. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's make sure stories like Louis's don't disappear into silence. I'll see you in the next one.